Good morning. This is Rob Wilson with Actigraph, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on digital biomarkers and wearable sensors. It looks like we have around 160 folks registered for the conference, so we're pleased to have a nice group of both of our academic partners as well as our pharmaceutical and CRO and clinical trial partners available for the webinar. As I mentioned, I'm Rob Wilson. I'm the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Business Development for Actigraph, and I'm joined today by Jeremy Wyatt, who is Actigraph's Chief Technology Officer and also the Chief Architect of our hardware and software solutions. As well, Tyler Guthrie, who is our new Director of Scientific Affairs, will join us. I'm sure some of you saw the press release a few weeks ago that we had established a Scientific Affairs division within Actigraph to help many of our academic partners and pharmaceutical partners to help develop digital biomarkers. And Tyler is going to speak on that briefly at the end of the webinar. So at Actigraph, we really believe that all chronic disease and its intervention is going to have some impact on activity and sleep. And we're in the very early days of the development of digital biomarkers and believe that hundreds of digital biomarkers in very specific diseases and patient group populations will be developed with some of the technology tools that are available today. So it's a very exciting time in digital biomarkers, and it's a very broad field. So we're going to start off with kind of our high-level view of that field, and then give some specific points around wearable sensing and how Actigraph is looking at this market specific to our customer base. This is going to be the first in the series of webinars, and we hope to follow this one in the not too distant future with a deeper dive with a very specific case study on digital biomarkers, and we hope you'll join us for that. But first, for those of you that may not be as familiar with Actigraph, just a brief overview. As many of you do know, we've been a global leader in wearable hardware and software solutions and activity and sleep for over 12 years. And our core customer base started out in the academic global research community, and we just listed a few of those logos below, but we're active in 85 countries and have hundreds of customers, and many of these are academic institution or government entities like NIH and others that have been using accelerometry and the study of activity and sleep metrics for many years. These are large-scale studies. Typically, they are multi-year and very complex, and they're looking at high-resolution data. So we're not talking about anecdotal step evidence or basic sleep metrics. They're looking at high-resolution 24/7 data that is developed from activity and sleep metrics. And really, they've looked at it in broad-based population studies as well as in most chronic diseases. So what happened is when digital biomarkers and wearable sensors kind of hit the mainstream 3-4 years ago, that reputation that we had carried over into what is now our clinical trial business, which really accounts for about 50% of our business now. And it was really mostly the leading pharma and biotech innovation teams that became aware of us. And they did that because we, in addition to having a lot of validation and academic publication around our hardware and software solutions, we have a 510K registered device. And we also had an ecosystem that was envisioned that would help deploy and manage wearable sensings within the context of a clinical trial environment. Equally, I think exciting to them was the fact that, hey, with this raw data that we could collect, there's a fantastic opportunity to improve not only the algorithms we have today around activity and sleep, but really to look at some of this higher resolution data and get to additional endpoint claims around very specific activity and sleep metrics. So we've come a long way, although we're still on the learning curve, and I always say we're kind of in the second inning of a 9-inning game, baseball game today, but we have come a long way. And you look back to 3 or 5 years ago, and I've just articulated a couple of the transitions that we've experienced as a company. And this really happened because when activity fitness trackers kind of hit the mainstream with introductions by both folks like Fitbit and Apple, and as you all know, there's been a host of over 300 somewhat consumer-centric sensors between then and now hit the stream. It really raised the visibility of how this real-life data, real-time data could be used to look at patient care. But the difference between then and now is quite significant. It wasn't uncommon for us in the early days to have kind of reactive calls from some of our pharma or clinical trial clients. And they would kind of be saying, well, we've decided to use a wearable sensor, and here's what we're going to do, after the protocol was already developed. And at that point, we tried to help them connect to some of our experts in the field of actigraphy and accelerometry to give them some guidance. Even though they were looking at smaller studies and they were not that concerned with the device or the potential metric like a step, they were looking at it in an exploratory endpoint. We thought that it would help inform them if you have a specific academic institution that's already studied PAH or depression or osteoarthritis or heart disease, using accelerometry to help inform them on what that patient operational burden might look like, and also what endpoints you might want to target in that trial. So we've come a long way, and we see now that our clients on the pharma and the clinical trial side are much more intentional and specific. They're looking at large studies, phase 3 studies in scale. We really believe in 5-10 years time, there won't be any clinical trial and post-marketing approval that won't include some form of 24-hour wearable sensing. And they're much more focused on a high scientific bar for validity, and realize that with higher resolution, the opportunity for using targeted devices and algorithms can actually result in a very specific improved patient income and claim. So now we get these calls on the very front end of a clinical trial to reach out for more collaborative protocol development. And the reason is they're looking to reduce the friction of the clinical trial process and increase the scale so that we can use these in more and more studies. So what we'd like to do now is maybe just talk through a little bit of the view of the digital marker universe from a high level. And to that event, I mean, this is obviously an explosion in interest. And I always say you can tell how much interest there is in any given healthcare segment by the number of conferences and trade groups that actually target that subsegment. And over here on the left, we list quite a few of those. So there really has been an increase in the focus and attention on this digital biomarker universe. Even so now, Ray Dorsey, editor-in-chief, has established this digital biomarker journal recently, and Ray's a real thought leader, and that publication gives a good view as to how you might go about looking at digital markers for claims. But the whole universe of digital markers, biomarkers, includes many data sets. So in the middle, you see electronic medical records, genomic information, and wearable sensors can all provide a marker. And of course, the thing they have in common is that's a tremendous amount of data. But the opportunity it is there to make sense of that data and value. And I have a quote here from Nelia at IQVIA. Murray Aitken and the team there at the IQVIA Institute did an excellent digital health report in November of last year that kind of laid out the landscape of digital health and how that's going to unfold, and would highly recommend that to you. But it really is the next wave of personalized medicine. And then, of course, on the right, there are a number of organizations that are looking after this market. And what I would say here is that it really does take a village of different approaches and different participants to make this happen in size. And it really is the fact that it's not going to be one size fits all. So there'll be a number of vendors and device and data interpreting groups, as you see here, and even in specific applications. I mean, most of you saw last week the announcement by Apple on their ECG and predictive arrhythmia, as well as fall detection from their device. And of course, that follows on the heels of AliveCor and their ECG arrhythmia detection, which has been out for a while now as well. So even in a very specific application in a chronic disease, there could be different devices and different approaches that could yield value. And of course, we've been fortunate to to work with a number of the innovation teams, both at the CRO and the pharma partnership level. And they have been very willing to look at creative ways to improve the adoption of these methods in wearable sensing. And then, of course, you've seen recently the 23andMe and Glaxo $300 million drug development deal, and that just kind of reiterates the fact that with all of these large data sets, there's a growing awareness that a digital biomarker of meaning to help improve health can be sought and be used to improve patient care. So I think we'll try and transition now to kind of a bigger level of what do we mean by digital biomarker, and I've just pulled a couple of definitions here that we've looked at, and the first one on the left side is really a biomarker definition by NIH, which has been in work for some time. But the key components of that is that the first two parts of it, it's an objective measurement and an indicator of a process. And so both the objectivity and the interpretation point of biomarkers is something that we feel is extremely important. And we actually like this digital biomarker definition from Rock Health, which is consumer-generated physiological and behavioral measures collected through connected digital tools that can be used to explain, influence, or predict health-related outcomes. And of course, without the ability to explain, influence, and predict, we're not going to be of much value to the patient and to the providers and to the drug developers. So we have these tools. How do we make meaning, and why is it important? So here's just a few examples of again, why we look at this: the real world data, the near real-time availability of that data due to technology, and the ability to connect with the patient. And again, Ray Dorsey did an excellent presentation on biomarkers that I think is still available on the web, and he makes the excellent point that 95% of what happens to our patient subject population, it does not happen in the clinic, and it doesn't happen in terms of a very specific measurement. So the ability to use some of these tools we have now in wearable sensing to provide that additional context is hugely important, with the value that it can actually improve that care to that patient, lower the cost of delivery of care to that patient, and improve the drug development efficiency. And you see here the quote from Ken Gett's team at Tufts Center for Drug Development. We're not making as much progress as we would like to on the length of time of a clinical trial and the exorbitant cost. So let's think of new ways to deploy these technologies to improve that outcome. Having said that, there's a lot of evidence, not just anecdotal, but real life now in our experience of what the real challenges are in deploying digital biomarkers and wearable sensors. And you see just a small smattering of major categories, but the volume of data is something that is very intense. You're talking about gigabytes of raw data at high sample rates. So for example, the German National Cohort, which is a client of ours and has a study running with 200,000 subjects using 7-day samples of 24-hour accelerometry, sampled at 100 hertz. You could see how quickly that amount of data piles up. So in addition to that, people have struggled with both device and ecosystem validation, and that is something that continues to be a focus of our company, and I think people who are looking to get broad scale adoption. In addition to the value of the data, so it's not just about the device, it's really about the device and the ecosystem supporting a framework where that information can be properly interpreted and lead to an endpoint and an outcome that's of value to the patient. And that is a learning process as you use these new tools. Lastly, the regulatory environment is in a rapidly evolving market. The FDA, EMA, Health Canada, and the slew of regulations around GDPR and 21 CFR 11 have transitioned, but these are real issues that have to be grappled with. And we give kudos to the FDA and their leadership team and folks like Bakul Patel and Leonard Sachs, who's been involved with CTTI, and Scott Gottlieb to really kind of paint a picture for embracing how we might use these tools within the context of a clinical trial. So all of this is happening in a field of very rapid technological change, where the tools, whether it's the battery or the memory or the storage or the cloud infrastructure processing or new tools of analysis like machine learning and artificial intelligence get applied to that data, they're also rapidly evolving. So right now I want to transition we've got a couple of polling questions for the group here, and we're just going to take a couple of minutes to ask, how likely are you to include a wearable sensing digital marker in an upcoming clinical study or trial? And you can select one of the four choices there, whether you're not quite sure, you're very unlikely, you're likely, or you're very likely, or already have that in process, I guess. So maybe we'll just take a couple of seconds and.
Okay, all right, we're closed.
So in the poll result there, we've got very likely 61% and likely 30%. And there's still a group of around 10% or so that are uncertain. And I think that's a good answer, in that there's always uncertainty when you adopt a new technology. And so the more people feel comfortable with the validation and execution, the more likely they are to adopt. So the second polling question is, what do you see as the highest benefit of deploying wearable sensing digital biomarker in a study? And those choices are the real-time data and objective measurement of patient behavior, the potential for improved outcome measurement and label claim, the ability to engage the patient and satisfaction for better compliance, and the ability to improve a study or the efficiency. In a couple seconds here, and we'll close. So the real-time data and objective measurement of patient behavior is 81%. The potential for improved outcome measurement and label claim is 13%. And then at 3% each, patient engagement and improved study and trial efficiency. So that's very helpful. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeremy White, who is our Chief Technology Officer, and as I mentioned, the architect of both our hardware and software solutions. Jeremy?
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everyone for coming out and attending today. I want to transition just a second into a little bit of a technical discussion, and no surprise there, but specifically around wearable sensing and digital biomarkers. I think that one thing I hope to relate in these webinar series, this being the first, is what are we talking about? What's different than what we're used to seeing with digital measurements in the home? What do we see from Actigraph's perspective, having done 50 clinical trials plus? What do we see is the difference between your standard processes and where the trends are heading? Just to start that out, I think most people think of data collection and the interpretation of wearable data in a format that looks sort of like what I'm showing here. Specifically, we all know there's some sort of raw source signal or some kind of PPG heart rate monitor or an accelerometer. And then secondly, kind of stage two is this notion of data processing or data reduction. Our academic partners that we've been working with for almost 15, 20 years now have really done an amazing job in this middle section of correlating the raw signal into something that represents a surrogate for something that we're all used to seeing. And you can see kind of the linear regression line in the middle there. We do our best effort, and the academics do a great job of interpreting that as a correlation. And then some of the measurements you're used to seeing come out of those right on the right. So calories, steps, cut points, you've all heard of those. Some devices even flights of stairs you've taken, or some objective health number. And a lot of times this processing and these measurements, we'll see them happen on the device itself or near, on the phone itself that they're using. The trend that we're seeing really though is this return back to the raw source signal. I think that we see that return. Why do we see that return? Because we think, and we're observing new and better ways of processing that data. And so we're often in these days experience people who are applying neural networks, learning algorithms, or different methods to that data to extract what we consider to be novel outcomes and algorithms. And the things on the right in the bottom are different, maybe measures you've never considered or even heard of from the traditional measures. To get to these novel algorithms requires a different approach. It requires getting an unadulterated signal. It requires getting it in kind of a large data set way and processing it using some novel new methods. You'll notice in the top section, we've got some linear correlation. In the bottom, who knows what's going to happen? Things are nonlinear, things move around, and that's just the way humans experience life. And so we see this processing and heavy lifting happening on the data to give us a better picture of what's happening in that person's life. And if you want to get more information on this process, please check out the CTTI, or Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative's novel algorithms or novel outcomes program that they have on their website. Some good information there. I thought I'd just quickly make this point about how data is interpreted with this simple example around steps. I think if we think about how steps are calculated on maybe a watch wearable or a wearable that's on your phone, often we think about this process where you've got, again, raw data, and then there's some steps algorithm, which then produces our step counting outcome. Well, our academics, once again, they've been doing this for years, and they know, of course, there's a raw signal, but there's this idea of high specificity around that data. And so I need to apply a different method based on the paradigm that I'm looking at. So maybe I'm looking at youth, maybe I'm looking at a CNS disease patient, maybe I'm looking at a COPD patient and their recovery as they walk through some sort of intervention. Each of those might produce a different type of step. I like to use the example of, my grandmother doesn't take the same type of step as my 5-year-old. And so the importance around the interpretation of that raw signal cannot be overemphasized. And as digital biomarkers evolve and we see a focus in on the claim for that information, the source of that data and how it's interpreted become even more important than they have in the past. So speaking of the technology, I think everyone looks at Actigraph and they think, well, you guys make a product that measures accelerometry. We do. But I want to just make this point about the raw signal and how from the device, that is kind of the crux of where everything starts for us. So let me just walk you through. This is a slide that I shared recently with a group around standardizing raw data and some of the considerations that we take into account every day as we make our products and our systems here. One thing we always bring up is the core accelerometer. What is it? What's the sample rate? How am I taking care of the anti-aliasing, the dynamic range? What happens if that accelerometer is no longer available in the market? How do I mitigate that in future products for comparison? How do I calibrate the device? Many of these consumer products, we'll see they'll buy an accelerometer and then they'll sell that product without any consideration for the type of calibration they may do to ensure that they have an unadulterated signal. This graphic on the right is a little noisy, but the point is we calibrate our product in 14 different positions to ensure that it's always giving us 1G, no matter the orientation. So how does the device handle data during low power modes? Does it go to sleep? Do we miss data? And then finally, how do we mitigate the logistical challenges of the specific device and getting the data off of it, transferring that data, reducing the data? These are all just in the paradigm of the device, not to say anything about the ecosystem, which I'd like to talk about next. So our approach is really, as I just said, start with a validated device, start with raw data, get the signal to be an unadulterated, pure signal. And by the way, have traceability around that. If I'm calibrating it, how do I know when and how it was calibrated and what happens if calibration was messed up during manufacturing? Make sure there's a methodology. We have a methodology around big data capture. How do we do it? What do we look for? We realize, fourthly, that security, privacy, and the regulatory environment are just facts of life. And so we have to account for those. We have to make sure that our configurations are consistent from device to device. If I'm deploying a 4-country, 600-patient study, I need to make sure all those devices are sampling properly. They're all either showing the display or not showing the display. So consistency is key. And then academic collaborations, and then lower patient requirements. So what we try to do here with the lower patient requirements is we want to really ensure we're not burdening that patient. And so we'll typically work with the pharma or with the clinical study or the academic group to say, how can we ensure higher compliance? Sometimes in our case, that's a 30-day battery life on a single charge. Sometimes it's just a small unobtrusive device. Sometimes it's a customized watch band that fits that population better. But regardless, the 7 points here fit into an ecosystem, not a device. And so our solution and our approach is really a holistic approach. We try to bring in every aspect of the study and make sure we're considering those from the perspective of an ecosystem. And then finally, just to get to digital biomarkers, there's an operational factor. In the past, we've seen, as Rob said at the outset, we've seen this small beta pilot or anecdotal study happening. But now, with the value that you can extract from meaning from the data, we see these being deployed in a large scale. And so this on the left shows a sample clinical trial schedule. On the right, it's our specific patient guide that applies directly to that particular clinical trial. And that is designed really to help educate not only our investigators, but also our patients and how should I wear this device, what's expected of me. And so operationally, there's just these considerations that need to go into deploying a study. It's not just go buy a device off the shelf. Many times your patients have experience with these types of products, but those products and the patients themselves have not been considered in the context of a large study. And just to kind of summarize, these are our top challenges. Outside of a wearable, there's logistics, there's working with procurement, there's storing and transferring and meeting the requirements for big pharma on storing the big data, and then training requirements. So these are challenges that are just outside of the wearable that are part of the ecosystem. So I'd like to throw up another poll here and just kind of gauge the audience here. Say, what is your primary concern? So we've listed some of the things that we often see in a clinical trial. What is your primary concern in deploying a wearable sensing digital biomarker in a study? And I'll just leave that open for a few seconds, but options there, no concerns, maybe you're worried about inaccurate measurements, maybe you're not sure how you're going to interpret the data at the end of the study. Maybe you're worried about your patient, are they overburdened? Maybe regulatory requirements, you're not sure how it's going to play into the regulatory domain. So let's see what the audience had to say there. Looks like interpretation of data and inaccurate measurements. Both of those we hear often. In fact, it's usually the first call we get to our team ask the question, how do we do this and how do we know we can trust the data? That's some great information. And in fact, it's a great segue into our next little area here. I want to introduce Tyler Guthrie, who is our Director of Scientific Affairs. Tyler's going to talk to you a little bit about those challenges that you just presented as your primary concerns and what Actigraph is hoping to do in bridging the gap between academic and pharmaceutical and clinical trials.
Thanks, Jeremy. So that segues perfectly. So I'm just going to take a minute to introduce our new department and what the goals of that department are. And Rob mentioned earlier that we've created this new department known as the Scientific Affairs Department, which was a direct response to the growing need from sponsors and CROs for scientifically validated endpoints. The development of this department serves several purposes. One is to bridge the knowledge gap that exists between academic researchers that have years of experience with actigraphy and sponsors that are just starting to explore these new digital biomarkers. We have relationships with some of the leading researchers in the world that can help guide study teams and data teams on what the most applicable endpoints are, as well as how best to analyze the data collected. Another is to share our experiences in past clinical trials and help with protocol development in terms of existing endpoints that could be used for that therapeutic area and other operational considerations. We're able to share what methods have been successful in these trials and what have not. Lastly, is to partner with specific academic groups and other research groups to improve current endpoints and algorithms and develop novel endpoints that can help identify behaviors and trends in patients that have not previously been possible. Much of this is based around the raw data that's collected by the devices. Some examples include scratch detection, tremor detection, and improved cut points for specific therapeutic populations. We want to be able to help guide clinical trial teams to be as effective as possible from protocol development to optimal deployment procedures to data filtering and analysis. This results in reduced patient and site burden, reduced costs, and improved outcomes. And we do have one more poll question for you. It's how willing are you to collaborate in protocol development and data interpretation around wearable sensing digital biomarkers? So we have a few options for you. So we have already collaborated. You are very willing to collaborate. You're somewhat willing, or you're not willing at all to collaborate. And so the results are highest is very willing at 53%. So that's good to hear. Next we have somewhat willing at 17%. We have already collaborated, and then a small portion are not willing.
Thanks, Tyler. That's great feedback, guys. Thank you all for participating in our polls there. And a lot of those just reinforce what we've seen and what our experience has been in these clinical trials. In fact, if you're interested in collaborating, we have several trials that are upcoming that we'd love to engage with you. So I've got a conclusion slide next that's just going to wrap up those bullets. But at the end, I've got an email address that you can reach out and grab us at. So just in conclusion, guys, it's really exciting times. There's a significant learning curve, but gosh, the opportunity is just there to really improve on the efficiency of these trials, improve on patient outcomes, and just to make this world of clinical trials better, but doing it in ways maybe we've not considered yet. And because of that, second bullet is scientific validation and evidence is paramount. We have to start with pure, clean signals. You know, the products that we've seen or that we're seeing in digital biomarkers and wearable sensing, maybe those products have a source signal that is not something that we've seen before. You know, we're used to blood pressure, we're used to other measures, but with these new novel ways, the validation and the evidence is critical to make the correlation. Technology is really evolving quickly. We see this move away from processing everything in real time to really coming back and saying, hey, we have in raw data essentially DNA, and there's so much meaning in there that we can get out of it. So the technology is evolving to get that meaning out of the data. Digital devices impact existing operational logistical issues. It's going to be a little bit challenging to get these things in the study. Consider it as an ecosystem approach, regardless of what type of wearable you're deploying. It's a great opportunity to bridge the existing methodologies with the future. So Tyler spoke to that, kind of Actigraph's position on that. That applies to us, but of course, in other areas of heart rate, heart disease, there's opportunities abound. And then finally, collaboration and transparency will accelerate that adoption. So exciting times. Our next webinar coming up in just a few weeks will actually be a deep dive into a comprehensive case study that Tyler's been a part of and we've been a part of in seeing this through. So we hope that you'll join us for that. We'll keep the communication up. We'd love to hear back from you. If you've got questions or if you just like to have a discussion with us, please reach out to us at webinars@actigraphcorp.com. We'd love to correspond with you and learn more about your study or about the opportunities that might be there with your group. We appreciate everyone attending today, and we look forward to connecting with you all in the near future. Thanks.